May all beings be happy. May all beings be healthy. May all beings be free from harm. May all beings love life. May all beings awaken. Welcome to another Gook Audio podcast. I'm DC Booba of Gook Audio and Gook Archives, preserving the legacy of Shunryu Suzuki and those whose paths crossed his, and anything else that comes to mind. I pray that you and yours are safe and comfortable, free from economic struggle, and able to get out and do whatever it is you want within the limitations of the universal precept of do as little harm as possible. So this is going to be a Tassajara story. One Tassajara story, not too long. And so we'll get right into it as soon as we've had our pause to meditate. So when you hear the bell, hit pause, if you wish, and meditate or whatever for as long as you wish. And when you're ready to come back, hit unpause. And we'll be here waiting to hit the bell to begin the next piece from Tassajara Stories. The Early Years with Shunryu Suzuki. A work in progress. Bad Bob. Bob and I had spent so much time together that Suzuki wanted to ordain us together as priests. Either he saw through our erratic behavior that there would be a long-time commitment, or that was part of his program to promote a certain amount of chaos. We both drove Suzuki to talks he gave. Bob more than I because he was in the city more and he was more aggressive. Like he said, I stick to him like a glove. Once when Bob and I drove Suzuki to Mill Valley together, after Zazen and Suzuki's talk, we went to Bill and Laura Kwong's for breakfast. It was so sparse. Tiny bowls, miso soup, pickles, a dollop of rice gruel each, and green tea. We had a pleasant time with the Kwongs and their 4 sweet little boys. We bowed goodbye and drove straight to a cafe, and all 3 ate pancakes, eggs, and drank coffee. Bob made sure that Oksan, Mrs. Suzuki, knew he was available whenever her husband needed a ride. He didn't have a car, but he would have one already lined up. Bob had the gift of persuasion and didn't mind bending facts to suit his goals. Before Richard had gone to Japan, Bob saw him as a rival chauffeur. He knew that Oksan didn't like the way Richard drove. I know when I drove Suzuki, she'd make sure his seatbelt was on and comment on how she was glad I was driving him and not Richard, who went too fast. Bob would say ridiculously exaggerated things to reinforce her opinion, such as that the last time he went with Richard, Richard drove a... Pardon me. Richard drove 100 miles an hour. Suzuki let Bob and me drive him, though we tended to sleep a little when we drove. I remember driving Suzuki to a Quaker meeting in Stockton, invited by Dan's parents. Philip in the back seat kept telling me I was going to kill his teacher because I was falling asleep. A lot of truckers do that on purpose. Ted Marshall told me once he was hitchhiking and got picked up by a trucker who told him, "If I fall asleep, don't wake me." It's not like deep sleep, it's driving sleep. I used to drive and sleep a lot in my old sleep-deprived days, a situation which I'd say was encouraged, if anything, by Suzuki. One might even say he and many of his students were codependently sleep-deprived. But then Suzuki wanted us also to stay awake. He'd say, "When you're sleepy, your ego is sleepy too." Bob would always sit as close to Suzuki as he could in the city Zendo, where seats were not assigned. Reb did that too, and when he and Bob were both there, Bob would get to the Zendo earlier to get the closest seat. One problem with Bob being that close was that due to his habit of staying up late, he frequently was sleepy in zazen. Suzuki would get up during the periods and go around with his teacher's stick, correcting postures and giving the nodding too quick whacks on each shoulder. After notifying them first, resting the stick on the right side, Bob would straighten up before Suzuki got to him. One day, Bob was nodding so hard that Suzuki got up just for Bob, who straightened up, so Suzuki went back. That continued a few times till Suzuki just stayed right behind Bob and hit him as soon as he started nodding, and stayed there, continuing to hit him harder and harder each time he fell asleep till the period was over. Bob assigned great weight to anything Suzuki said and would take on new habits accordingly. He asked Suzuki if what we eat is important. Suzuki, who was not eager to hear food fetish questions, said, "Yes, but it's more important how you sleep, and it's best not to read before going to bed." So Bob stopped reading before sleeping. Bob told me to stop too, and I told Bob he only said that so you'd get more sleep. After zazen at Sokoji, students would line up in gacho with Suzuki on their way out. Bob would rehearse his bow in front of a mirror, compose it beforehand. At Tassajara, Bob would make sure to give Suzuki the idea that he was available when Suzuki stepped out of his cabin to work in his garden. The head of whatever crew he'd been assigned to for that time wouldn't intervene if Bob told him he was working with Roshi this morning. Bob was strong and could move big stones well. Philip Wilson was stronger and went way back with Suzuki. If Philip was there, he'd get the job, but Bob made sure he was next in line in those early days. Of course, others did stone and garden work with Suzuki, but no one else was craftily positioning themselves to maximize their chances. He said that Suzuki would play with him and Philip by suggesting they move a stone that was probably too heavy for them to move. Bob said he and Philip were so eager to prove themselves to Suzuki that they'd wear themselves out struggling with that task or any that Suzuki gave them. Bob said that sometimes it seemed that Suzuki had a special relationship to stones, that he would move one barely touching it with his hands, that the stones seemed to move however Suzuki wanted them to. Before Richard made a special bath time for the abbot, Suzuki would bathe with the men. That was before the first practice period. Bob would make sure that he went in at the same time and would offer to scrub Suzuki's back. He noticed that Suzuki wore a sweater that only covered the abdomen. Suzuki called it a haramaki. He said he always wore one. Bob ordered one for each of us from S.K. Ueda in L.A., a department store that catered to the Japanese-American community. Bob tended to ascribe a degree of magical power to Suzuki and thus to the haramaki. Bob said that once at Sokoji that Suzuki wanted to get into the attic to check out the pigeons that were cooing up there, especially during mating season. It was a large old building with a huge attic. The entrance to the attic was in the high ceiling above the long kitchen table. Bob thought the way to get there was to put a chair on the table. He turned to get a chair, and when he turned around, Suzuki was already up there sticking his head down. Bob could not see how he got there. Bob said Suzuki told him that instead of manifesting a big dragon, that he had a little dragon in his kimono people couldn't see. Yeah, Bob said, he had a secret dragon. He said that in his office not long after he flew up to the ceiling. Building a retaining wall in the little creek by the bridge, Bob said he saw Suzuki hurl a heavy stone down at Mike Daft below and call out Mike's name when it was in midair. He said that it was a miracle that Mike caught it and wasn't injured, and that Suzuki had that confidence in him. I said I thought that he was at times an unreliable witness, but he swore that's what he saw. I think one thing that bonded Bob and me is that we enjoyed not being normal and didn't see being so as a path to salvation. And we had a history of such. I can remember being a teenager running alongside a slow-moving bus, screaming and making faces, would dream up with friends acts to do in public to freak out random people, like inside a theater lobby, walking into each other, falling down, getting up, doing it over again and again. We'd be laughing uncontrollably, rolling in the aisle of a restaurant, and then we'd spend hours reading poetry, visiting wise elders to talk about profound topics, and playing bridge. It could be wacky or deep, but nothing in between. Teen Bob, with then best bud Reb, both robust, walked down Minneapolis sidewalks side by side, clearing them, fists meeting at sternum, elbows protruding, forcing all others to hug the building or step into the gutter. But he also took care of an invalid and started reading Buddhist books. Bob climbed the circular stairs to the top floor of the Minneapolis Public Library, slipped over the guardrail, and hung by one hand way up there until people started noticing and becoming alarmed, and a librarian chastised him. Actually, turning on to pot and acid a few years before we met had calmed us down some, allowed us to enjoy what was happening by just being there. And then coming to Zen Center had a major maturing effect. But there was still a ways to go. Bob would outdo me, though. With him, I'd become a spectator, sometimes a slightly nervous one, like on our trip to Fort Worth, my hometown. He started talking to some cowboys in a car next to us at a light. I say talking, but really he was putting them on, pretending to be friendly. Tough young guys who might be called rednecks. I grew up there and never got in a fight or got beat up because I knew how not to get guys like that angry. They go out, drink beer, and look for fights. I told him, do not mess with them. The light turned green, and I made a quick left turn in front of oncoming traffic, and they went on straight ahead. I begged Bob not to do that again. My mother was in love with him because he sweet-talked her and gave her the massage of her life. I suggested he stick with that persona and drop the one seeing how far he can go with taunting the locals. Suzuki had given a talk where he referred to Dogen's instructions to the Tenzo, the monastery cook, wherein Dogen wrote of 3 minds the Tenzo must have. They were big mind, kind mind, and joyful mind. Kind mind was Roshin, and the Ro meant old, so Suzuki called it grandmother mind. Bob picked up on that and would refer to grandmother mind in conversations with people who didn't know anything about Buddhism. It's basically about grandmother mind, he'd say, and leave it at that. And then there was masturbation mind. He told me one day that he had attained that mind in the Zendo. He said that he'd successfully brought on an orgasm while sitting in the Zendo with a student sitting on each side of him, and that he did it so masterfully that they didn't notice. He said that he hadn't intended to do so, but that due to some sexual fantasizing, he'd gotten an erection which stood his John Thomas up to where it touched his hands together in a mudra. He slid his mudra down over the throbbing member and then discreetly, slowly brought his mudra back up and down until he experienced a climax, which he said was most pleasant, though requiring him to do some laundry at the next break. And then he'd pull that masturbation mind card out and play it in serious Dharma discussions, as in, well, it all comes down to masturbation mind, throwing everyone else off for a confused moment. Bob, Mary, and I were in Albuquerque at a cafe off the road. They had paperback books on racks that revolved. There was a very nice young waitress there, and we were the only customers. I tried to strike up a conversation with her, but she wasn't interested. Within a few minutes, Bob had her ready to quit her job and take off with us. He picked a book out of the rack and started philosophizing surrealistically about it. She was enthralled. I thought, wow, I was being sincere, and he's just toying with her. And she prefers that. At the table, she took our order, and when she brought the drink, she hung around a minute and made small talk, and in so doing, Bob disclosed that he and I had been practicing Buddhism. And she said she'd of course heard of it and asked him to tell her something about it. Well, he said, looking deeply into her eyes, it's basically about cultivating grandmother masturbation mind. Oh, once again with Bob, I buried my head in my hands. This has been a Gook audio podcast of Tassajara Stories. I'm DC Puba of Gook Audio and Gook Archives, coming to you from Sleepy Sanur with Doggett Bandita, Feline Cuchita, and dear lovely Katrinka. And we're wishing you and yours and all of us a grand awakening.